Great. So thank you all for, I guess, not joining me, but allowing me to join you today. I know you're running a little bit late, and I've got loads to say, so I'll kind of breeze through some slides, but they're available. I'll share them with Marnie afterwards, just to keep the time a little bit more reasonable. I don't like to stand between people and food or alcohol. So I am a political anthropologist, but I founded this institute. It actually was something that emerged from the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship that I received in 2021. And, the general idea is to provide a really robust academic and field research basis for creating immediate change in the context that I work in, or having some kind of positive impact. What I will talk about today is, it's basically a project that has begun, or that began in 2022 as a team through present day. I'll focus a lot on what I've been learning in the last month, though. So we hosted a series of multi-sector workshops that convened veterans and a lot of members from the institutional, NGO, and international community in Kyiv, and then did field research and attended various, fora and conferences across Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Lviv. I think that's all of it. I've tried to cover a lot because it's a big question, so I'm not couching this in a particular discipline. This will be a far more sort of applied presentation, but I would, encourage you, reach out to me. I did just put like my WhatsApp and Signal in the chat if anybody has questions. This is mostly qualitative, well, it's all qualitative and field-based research that I'm drawing from. So first, I already said that, so I'm going to skip that. In Kharkiv in particular, I've connected with Frontline Medical, International Legion, and SOF units. Some of the SOF veterans that I work with are Ukrainian SOF Special Operations Forces. So the SOF veterans that I work with are Ukrainian. The SOF more actively participating folks are American or through American networks, and with veterans organizations. Anything I say that sort of suggests a Ukrainian view is not drawing from the conversations that I've had with International Legion members. And then, a lot of government and international agencies in Kyiv. We were there for the Black Sea Security Forum in Odessa, where we engaged with a lot of folks in bilateral meetings about maritime security and strategy discussions. As a caveat, when I talk about sort of findings, I'll give just a really brief illustration. So 2 nights ago, I was on a train from Kyiv to Ivano-Frankivsk, where there's a big conference on veteran reintegration, and I was sort of in the space between the 2 cars at 1 o'clock in the morning with 4 other people trying to smoke cigarettes without burning each other or blowing smoke in each other's faces. And they were asking me sort of, what am I doing here? And I explained, and they said, well, it's all over now, presumably referring to the recent operation, the spiderweb operation. But about 30 minutes prior to that, the Kharkiv Telegram channels had started sort of buzzing nonstop, and the city experienced one of the worst assaults, especially in residential areas, since the beginning of the war. So the war in Ukraine and the veteran experience, I'm using these very broadly. It's so heterogeneous in each of those categories, so I just hope you'll forgive the broad brushstrokes that I'm using for this presentation. So in terms of big, changes since 2022 across different areas of security, there's been a proliferation of drone manufacturers up through this year, and I'm sure that will continue. There's really fast iteration and battlefield-driven design, and I say that both in terms of technology, but also in tactics and leadership. I have a piece that's coming out in another special operations periodical that's about how reactions to crises of command on the battlefield in the earliest days of the war have contributed to a very innovative and decentralized form of leadership that's quite, I think, unique in at least at a military-wide level. And has been very effective within the special operations units. There's some sort of technical information there about just the increased drone range autonomy and lethality, and the effective operations that they're able to execute without major naval assets. And then the merging, which is not an uncommon dynamic in war, of civilian technology being adapted for combat use. And we actually have World War II to thank for Nutella, if you were not familiar with that. You're gonna have to Google that one. So in terms of economic and industrial change over the last few years, there's obviously been a revival of legacy defense firms, stronger IP protections. There's a quite active, policy engagement in terms of how to protect IP, but also connect it to international capital markets with regards to the incredible technology that's coming out of this war. Incredible technology coming out of a set of very tragic circumstances, I should say. There has actually, after the initial, I wouldn't even say collapse of the economy, but after the initial dip in the economy, there's been a very rapid reestablishment of the large multinational firms that were operating here before, and rising investment. And some of them are even back to pre-war levels, which really matters when you're thinking about future economic sustainability and development. I'll get to some of the challenges that they face later. But basically, there are labor shortages because a vast majority of the population is either on the front lines serving those soldiers, or somehow in rehabilitation, or they've been displaced or have emigrated. But ironically, there are also a lot of veterans that are having a hard time finding jobs. So there's a big opportunity there to align the private sector labor shortages and hiring needs with the veteran population with the recovery and reconstruction in view. In terms of some of the security challenges, so I have a bit of a background in irregular warfare, and so irregular warfare being distinct from hybrid warfare in ways that most people don't care about, but very similar to hybrid warfare. And there are active engagements across digital, economic, and physical domains. Cybersecurity is a huge issue right now in terms of concerns, and I think will be one of the larger concerns, along with crypto, in terms of whatever the after looks like in this war and the rise of criminal actors and non-state armed groups. And then obviously destabilizing and using it for psychological operations or propaganda or misinformation as well in the cyberspace. And already, we've seen the regional destabilization efforts happening in the area, which is no coincidence in the context of the current Russian full-scale invasion. In terms of integrated deterrence, which for those, if you're not familiar, is just this idea of mobilizing the various kinds of capital and assets and policies that you need to make an act of aggression more costly than, because of the risk that it entails, than it would be to pursue some other alternative. So there were pre-2022 warnings that were unheeded, so that has been viewed by some as an initial breakdown in deterrence. I think even here, if you ask the question, were you surprised? I think most people that I've spoken to, actually everyone I've spoken to, has said yes, when the Russians first walked across the border. So I'm sure there are those that disagree, but everyone I've spoken to, it was actually a surprise. And so there's a current focus on rebuilding the strategic credibility and capabilities at the national level, which is very difficult in a volatile global political environment. That's my euphemism for this presentation. And then there are particular gaps in nuclear security discussions and guarantees right now that do need to be addressed. So this is Dmitry and his wife, Eva. I might come back to them a little bit to illustrate some of the points, but again, I'm going to try not to go on for too long. My research is really focused on reintegration, but there are a few sort of philosophical or baseline underpinnings that drive my work, both in research and practice, that I think are important to sort of put out first. First is that I believe that reintegration planning and execution should begin with the first casualty of war. That is not how it is treated in the policy domain, and I believe it's a big oversight. The other thing, too, is that it is a whole of society question, and has been articulated very intensely here, where, by the veterans that I've worked with. We're not the problem. Society needs to reintegrate into our lives. I don't entirely agree with that. I think that, okay, so returning to Dimitri and Eva on the previous slide, Eva was sharing with me that most nights she has to get up and collect her husband from, the corner of the house somewhere in the middle of the night, having, traumatic flashbacks. And he was one of the people that said that, I'm fine, but it's society that needs to learn how to deal with us. So I think probably somewhere in the middle, is where we often find the truth of the matter. So, but that it is a society-wide effort. So those are a couple of pieces that inform my framing of the research and practice that I do, that I think are important. And it's a massive issue. So prior to the full-scale invasion, there were about 850,000 veterans. The post-Soviet bureaucracy was already collapsing under the weight of that. The Ministry of Veterans Affairs was only 4 years old to begin with. And then we're at about 1.2 now. The number varies depending on who you talk to. Massive problems accessing benefits, anticipated to rise to 2+ million veterans in whatever an end looks like. And then if you factor in the family members and the family members of the fallen, you're looking at a 5 to 8 million population number. So the infrastructure is absolutely overwhelmed by demand across all sectors. I've worked, advising the EU Council, the Swedish government, with grassroots organizations, all sectors. It is impossible to get somebody from the Ministry of Veterans Affairs on the phone. And there's a lot of hypotheses as to why that's the case. I think my most generous interpretation would be that if you asked any organization to, quadruple or 800 times of the capacity that it had over the course of 3 years, not 800 times, sorry, 8 times the capacity of what it had previously managed in the course of 3 years, nobody would be able to do that. So I think that the scale of the problem is massive in terms of processing and supporting these individuals and their families. The state is not well equipped to handle it. And so it's sort of, I view it as an all hands on deck kind of scenario. These are, I mentioned some of these already. I think definitely an eye to traditionally underserved and underrepresented populations will be important, as well as rural service delivery. That's going to be a big problem here. A lot of resources are concentrated in a few major places in the country. And there's a very high risk, and this is a conversation I've been having with some other veteran organization leaders here. It's not even high risk, it's happening. That so much money goes into the big cities, but there are so many small fragmented CS, like veteran-led organizations and community organizations there, that basically everybody ends up with $25, right? Whereas in Kharkiv, there's an outstanding veterans organization that's very well organized. They have a good structure. They know how to run an organization. They can mobilize 500 individuals, which is, all of that is, way above average in terms of capabilities, but it's hard to get money out to Kharkiv. So I see my role as advocating, on behalf of the organizations that I'm seeing working wherever they are, to the international community to start better aligning what's being spent with what is needed and what is possible. Psychosocial needs are legion, to borrow a war-informed term. There's limited trauma-informed care that's increasing, not fast enough. There are certainly stigma and cultural norms attached to seeking counseling of some kind, and sexual assault, is underreported. And it is particularly underreported with regards to sexual assault within Ukrainian military units. There are some organizations far ahead of mine in terms of advocating for this to become sort of better addressed in a contextually appropriate way, but I think there's a long road ahead for that as well. The families lack adequate support mechanisms, and peer networks have shown to be very effective, but can be underfunded and also fragmented, as I mentioned before. This is just an example of, sort of the everyday life. So this is a buddy of mine that messaged me, like, look what we found today. And it had just fallen, I don't know, it's probably about 3 meters from the wall of their home, which had been built by the man who lived there, who was a veteran of the Kraken unit, and one of 50 survivors in a 2-battalion engagement, which is 1,200 people that started and about 50 people left at the end. And so this is, the dark humor, but this is sort of just everyday life now that he's back being a carpenter, and the kinds of, it's really, even when you're physically there, it's unimaginable because you've never lived through this in your life. And I think to pretend otherwise is perhaps irresponsible, which is why I believe that veterans need to be constantly involved as much as possible, and always more, in designing research, from designing research to conducting the research and collecting the data, to designing the programs that are meant to serve them, to advising the international organizations, because this is, it's unimaginable unless you're actually experiencing it. Economic integration, I'll be brief here. There are companies saying that they're, actively trying to recruit veterans. A recent report suggested that of the available veteran-specific jobs, a recent report by the UN, 0 were actually occupied. So there's a lot to do there in terms of, the perception is that there's stigma against hiring veterans. I think given the audience, I'll skip I'll skip the strategic recommendations, but I'm happy to address them. And I will just go to sort of conclusions and implications. And again, I'll share these slides. So the key findings from the research I've been doing now are that simply it's just historically unprecedented in terms of what needs to be managed, and what needs to be done. However, Ukraine is uniquely positioned, historically speaking and geopolitically now, for new partnerships. I think they're really well poised to thrive and flourish in certain sectors following the conflict in ways that don't damage their own security. And then if you want to talk about sort of the security risks of underattending veterans and rearmament and transnational organized crime, that's also something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. It's essential. Attending to the veterans and their families is critical for democratic stability. And yeah, I have plenty of examples as to why that would be the case. And they're both strategic assets and risks. So at the Institute, we advance a strengths-based approach to thinking about reintegration, because formerly armed actors, former combatants, ex-insurgents are generally approached with sort of, okay, how do we manage you so you don't cause us problems down the road? And they know that, and it doesn't feel great. So they actually bring a lot of strengths to the table. And when you're talking about the Ukrainian context, I mean, there is so much in terms of portfolios of leadership capabilities, technological know-how, tactical expertise, teamwork, just a lot that is there. And then a lot of these veterans came mid-career into their current service. So that's also a big challenge, which is that a lot of the upskilling programs for veterans that's out there are meant to upskill veterans from, let's say, manual laborers to IT professionals. But there are a whole swath of, general managers and mid-level executives that also cannot find work, and there aren't really programs designed for them. And they would add a lot to the economy. Ukraine needs somewhat predictably political and institutional commitment. Hopefully, I mean, it's a hard argument to make in the middle of a, existential war that you're fighting, that, okay, we need to also spend some money on, talking about feelings, but it does need to happen. And I think the hope is that a lot more will go into this at, the war's end. Accountability and efficiency are important. There's a lot of, at least for me, anecdotal only evidence of massive money laundering operations that are sort of under the cover of reconstruction projects, and I think some pretty clear indicators of strong mafia and organized criminal presence in places like Kharkiv. So, and that is discouraging for the international community, and might contribute to some reluctance to investing in some areas, probably areas where they need it most. Private sector mobilization, which is strong for the most part in Ukraine, but could do a little bit more in terms of veteran-specific recruiting and training. Peer and family-centered program design, most people are pretty on board with this. It's just a matter of getting it off the page and effectively and efficiently into these organizational spaces that are doing it right and not just in the right place. There's another phenomenon that happens, I've seen this everywhere, which is the organizations that are best capable of communicating to the international community and securing funding are not necessarily those that are actually doing the most effective work. They're just the ones that are the best able to get the funding. So that's another gap that I try to address with the research that I do. In long term, it's reintegration. It's, we're a 10, 20 year, maybe generation or two timeline if you want to think about intergenerational trauma. But in the midterm, at least, it's got to be a 10-year commitment by the international community in some form. You don't want paternalistic dependence on international funding, but there needs to be a long-term commitment here. It's for the security of the country, the region, and other places. As one former special operations colonel said to me in a way that was far better than I could ever write in my own words and get away with, is, if you don't help us now, you're going to see us on the battlefield later. And it's not for want of doing bad things. It's because that's going to be the best option, and those are the people who will pay us the most. So I echo that. This is somewhat overlap. So thank you. Here's my email address for those online. I've put my Signal. If you want to talk to me about Ukraine, WhatsApp and Signal are better. I'm much faster on those. So, but email is fine as well. So thank you.